Hello listeners, this video discusses Ezra Pound's ABC of Reading. This is a book by Ezra Pound published in the year 1934. In this book, Ezra Pound tries to create an approach by which one may come to appreciate and understand literature. One will completely focus on poetry. The text can also be considered as a guide to writing poetry. Ezra Pound, his full name is Ezra Weston Loomis Pound, born in the year 1885, died in the year 1972. He was an expatriate meaning a person who resides outside their native country. He's an American poet and critic. He's considered as a major figure in the early modernist poetry movement, and he's a fascist collaborator in Italy during World War II. Modernist poetry comes under in the tradition of modernist literature that dates between 1890 and 1950. Pound's contribution to poetry began in early 20th century. He developed the theme of imagism and economy of language. He worked in London as a foreign editor of several American literary magazines. He then shaped the works of his contemporaries such as T.S. Eliot, Ernest Hemingway, and James Joyce. He was responsible for James Joyce's serialization in the year 1914. James Joyce's work, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. He has also worked on Eliot's poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and the serialization of James Joyce's Ulysses in the year 1918. His important works include Reports, 1912, Hugh Selwyn Moberly, 1920, and his poem, The Cantos, written in 800 pages, and it is an epic poem. Ezra Pound lived in London between 1908 to 1914. Between 1914 to 1921, he left England and then he moved to Paris. He stayed there till 1924. And then he moved to Italy between the years 1924 until 1939. He stayed there. And then in World War II, he began a letter writing campaign that was between 1939 to 1945. And then he moved to United States. He stayed there between 1945 to 1958. Again, he moved to Italy between 1958 to 1972. Between 1958 to 1972, it was the time of depression. He has almost carried his literary works in World War I, World War II, and also during Depression. Until his death, he lived in Italy. He died in the year 1972. In this video, one can get a brief picture about the book ABC of Reading, written by Ezra Pound. This video also contains an overview of all the chapters that Ezra Pound has mentioned in ABC of Reading. Also, this video refers about the three main ideas, phanopoeia, melopoeia, and logopoeia, in the fourth chapter. Let us see an introduction of his book, ABC of Reading. This book was published in the year 1934, and it is a concise statement of Ezra Pound's aesthetic theory. It is a primer for the reader who wants to maintain an active, critical mind and who want to become increasingly sensitive to the beauty and inspiration of the world's best literature. And at the end of this book, there is a treatise on meter. It is an essay on creative development and the poet's relationship to music. In this essay, he has featured three sections. Firstly, he explores the requirements of authentic inspiration and how regulation inhibits the natural process. Here he talks about nomenclature and rhyming schemes. In the essay, he provides aspiration to read and write poetry. Through this book, Ezra Pound has displayed great ability to open new avenues in literature. Let us see the explanation of this book. Ezra Pound opens this book with three short statements. He gives a brief section for defining ABC. He identifies the audience for whom the volume is intended. He says that this book is intended for people, those who might like to learn. And the second introductory session, How to Study Poetry, he explains his intention that ABC of reading both expand and simplify his discussion in his earlier work, How to Read, which he published in the year 1931. In the foreword, he expresses that he has a belief that this book is impersonal enough to serve as a textbook. He also affirms that this book will be enlightening, or it will provide enlightenment in the classes in which this book is used. And in the third section, he notes it as warning. Here Pound makes something of an apologia. Apologia meaning a formal written defense of one's opinion. In simple terms, it is an apology or excuse or plea or a pretext. He admits that this section warning is a dull section in the book, and he promotes an harsh treatment of several writers whom he generally considered to be noteworthy. And all his explanations are followed by several sentences. Those are long statements on miscellaneous topics. He then denotes that a classic is classic because of its eternal freshness. This book totally divided into two main sections, and in section 1 it has 8 chapters. Each chapter varies in length from 7 lines to 25 pages. And then the section ends following by 2 brief unnumbered chapters. The name of the chapters are Dissociate and Diction is equal to Condenser. All 9 chapters in section 2 are loosely connected with subsections with exhibits of representation, poems or excerpts of literary works, and various miscellaneous outlines, chronologies. And then this book ends with a loosely organized essay, treatise on meter. Let us first see chapter 1. Chapter 1 is divided into 2 sections. The first section asserts that those who study poetry or other literature should use a scientific method that involves careful first-hand examination of the matter and which constantly compares one work with another. Pound often refers to Ernest Fellowes' work, The Chinese Written Character, as a medium for poetry in the year 1936. He then explains his concept of the ideogram. Pound has only edited Fellowes' book, The Chinese Written Character, as a medium for poetry between the years 1914 and 1915. And in the second section of the chapter, he uses an analogy. In chapter 2, Pound attempts to answer questions like what is literature, what is language, why study literature. He then defines literature as language charged with meaning. He says that literature is a fine line. He then says that literature is news that stays news. Then he talks about spoken language. Under spoken language, he says that spoken language is basically noise divided up into systems of grunts, hisses, etc. Whereas when he talks about written language, he says written language consists of signs with a given language group that represents the various noises of spoken language. Chapter 3 contains 2 brief sections, and in the first section he makes a number of statements of principle about literature and language. And in the second section, he focuses on the capabilities of language and the matter of the degree of ambition that a reader possesses. Chapter 4 opens with Pound's definition of great literature. He says that great literature is a language charged with meaning to the utmost possible degree, and he proceeds to identify three main ways in which language can be charged. He says that language can be charged through phanopoeia, melopoeia, and logopoeia. He never provided any concrete definition for these terms. Then this chapter's second section is identified with 6 categories of persons who have created literature. Number 1 is inventors, 2 masters, 3 diluters, 4 good writers without salient qualities, 5 writers of Pila's letters, and 6 is the starters of crazes. The third section in this chapter, titled as Compass, Sextant, or Landmarks, this chapter or this section offers what Pound proposes as the minimum list of writers of whom one would need to read to be able to judge the merits of other books properly. Then he gives names of those writers. They are Homer, Aeschylus, Sappho, Catullus, Propertius, and Ovid. And then this chapter follows with a brief section on Greek and Latin word order. Here, Pound proposes a list of medieval poems with which one should be familiar with. And the sixth chapter offers some suggestions to the readers who only read in English language, and Pound gives a few translations that Pound considers to be adequate. Then he mentions his own translations of the Tahio and the Seafarer. Tahio is a translation made by Ezra Pound, and it got published in the year 1909. He then approves Chaucer, Gavin Douglas, Golden, Christopher Marlowe, John Fleuriot, and Thomas Urquhart. Chapter 7 makes 2 main points. The first point is, only if a poem is well crafted will it stand up over the years. Second is melopoeia poetry. Melopoeia poetry is in the long run the same in all countries. And chapter 8 attempts to provide Pound's promise at the outset when he proposes to write textbook. And in this textbook, he includes miscellaneous notes, texts, and ideas for composition exercises. And then he begins a section titled Exhibits. Here he provides samples of poetry or translations of poetry of a number of poets, which is arranged in chronological order. And then followed by this, there is each sample that he gives to make comments, and then he gives suggestions for collateral reading. His list of authors goes like this. Chaucer starts with Chaucer in the 14th century and continues with Gauguin Douglas in the 15th century. Then Arthur Golding's translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses in the 16th century. Then Mark Alexander Boyd's Sonnets, Christopher Marlowe, then John Donne, Robert Herrick, Lord Rochester, Samuel Butler, and several other anonymous pastorals in the 17th century, and Alexander Pope, George Crabbe, and Walter Savage Landor in the 18th century. Then this is followed by a discussion of Walt Whitman's works, and he comments on Thomas Hardy's poetry. Then the book ends with a 3-section essay, which is loosely defined as treatise on meter. Here, Ezra Pound touches on a variety of definitions. He talks about rhythm and melody, opinions. Second definition he gives on mostly negative of writers of music and poetry. And then he gives definition of miscellaneous comments. mostly having to do with teachers, pupils, and poets. The second section, that is the last part of the book, is directed to those readers who have not understood section 1. Ezra Pound continues to comment on a number of topics related to versification and music. And here he makes a point that trying to follow a written prosody and melody is futile. He says that understanding of anything ultimately comes by listening and not by reading treatises. Let's see the important concepts that Ezra Pound dealt in this book. First, he talks about literature. He says that literature is language charged with meaning. Then he talks about great literature. Great literature is simply charged with meanings to the utmost degree. He says that literature and great literature can be achieved by three main ways. First is phanopoeia, which is throwing the object, fixed or moving, on the visual imagination. In simple terms, phanopoeia is defined as a casting of images upon the visual imagination. Number 2 is melopoeia, that includes emotional correlations by sound and rhythm of the speech. The third is egopoeia, which includes 1 and 2, that is phonopoeia and melopoeia. And by stimulating these associations with other word or word groups. So using three methods, one can achieve literature and great literature. Then he says that literature is news that stays news. He then talks about music. Music rots when it gets too far from the dance. Poetry artifies when it gets too far from music. He then affirms that he has not read half a book of Homer without finding melodic invention, and he asks the readers first to understand the melodic invention, and only after that one has to start to read. Then he says, without the foregoing minimum of poetry in other languages, no one can simply know where English poetry comes from. He then gives a list of writers which starts from Chaucer. He says that from Chaucer one can learn whatever that came over into the earliest English, and one can read without a dictionary of Chaucer's work. He says artists are the antenna of the race. Anyone can learn more about poetry by knowing and examining a few of the best poems. He then says that a honest critique must be content to find a very little contemporary work which is worth serious attention, and that perfect critique has to identify and recognize that little contemporary work which is serious. Only about melopoeia he mentions 3 times. Verse made to sing, the first one, then to chant or intone, third is to speak. And the chapter ends with an important essay, treatise on meter. Hope this video helps. If you have query, please write it down. And if you have any suggestion to make videos, please write it down in the comment section. Thank you for listening.